Some lunches were never meant to impress anyone. They were made quietly, in small kitchens, for one. In post-war Britain, many seniors lived alone, relying on simple meals that took only minutes to prepare. These weren't recipes passed down with pride, but routines built from habit, necessity, and long, silent afternoons. A slice of bread, a bit of cheese, perhaps something warmed on the stove, nothing fancy, yet deeply familiar. Today, we're stepping back into those quiet moments, uncovering 10 forgotten British lunches that filled empty rooms with a sense of comfort, even when no one else was there. It started with the sound of a kettle, always the kettle. In many small British flats during the 1950s and 60s, lunch for one was less about hunger and more about routine. One of the simplest meals quietly repeated day after day was cheese and pickle on bread. No cooking, no fuss, just a few familiar items placed carefully on a plate. The bread was usually sliced white, sometimes slightly stale, kept fresh as long as possible in a tin by the window. A thin layer of butter would be spread slowly, edge to edge, as if there was no reason to rush. Then came the cheese, often a modest block of cheddar, cut into uneven slices, never too thick. It wasn't about indulgence, it was about making do. But what gave this meal its character was the pickle. Sharp, dark, and slightly sweet, it added a contrast that made each bite feel complete. For many seniors living alone, that tangy taste broke the silence, offering a small moment of comfort in an otherwise quiet afternoon. There was no table set for guests, no second plate waiting. Just one chair, one cup of tea, and perhaps the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the background. This wasn't a meal meant to be remembered, yet it became part of daily life for thousands. Over time, it stopped being just food. It became a habit, a pause in the day, something predictable in a world that had slowly grown quieter. And even now, for those who remember, that simple combination still carries the feeling of being alone, but not entirely without comfort. It often began without thought, just a glance at the clock and the quiet realization that it was time to eat. In many British homes, especially among seniors living alone, lunch didn't require planning. One of the most familiar meals was a simple bowl of tinned soup, usually kept in the cupboard for days when energy felt low and silence felt heavier than usual. The tin itself was practical, unassuming, often stacked neatly with others just like it. Tomato, vegetable, or sometimes chicken. Nothing extravagant, just dependable. Opening it became part of the ritual. The soft click of the tin opener, the slow pour into a small saucepan, and the gentle sound as it warmed on the stove. There was something steady about stirring soup. No rush, no complexity, just the quiet motion of a spoon tracing circles. For many, this moment filled the room more than the meal ever could. Steam would rise slowly, carrying a familiar scent that felt oddly reassuring, like something that had never changed. It was rarely served with anything elaborate. Perhaps a slice of bread on the side, sometimes buttered, sometimes not. The focus wasn't on variety, but on ease. On making it through another quiet afternoon without too much effort. Meals like this weren't shared or spoken about. They existed in the background of life, unnoticed but constant. Yet over time, they became something more than convenience. They were a kind of quiet companionship, predictable, warm, and always there when needed. And in those still kitchens, with only the sound of a spoon against a bowl, even something as simple as soup could soften the feeling of being alone. It was the kind of meal that barely felt like cooking at all, something assembled more than prepared. In many British homes, especially during the 1940s and 50s, egg and cress sandwiches became a quiet lunchtime habit. For seniors living alone, it was simple, soft, and required very little effort, yet it carried a sense of familiarity that never faded. The eggs were often boiled earlier in the day, sometimes even the night before, left to cool in a small dish by the sink. Peeling them was done slowly, carefully, as if there was no need to hurry. Once sliced, they were placed onto buttered bread, usually white, sometimes slightly dry at the edges but still perfectly usable. Cress added something subtle but important. Its light peppery taste broke through the softness of the eggs, giving the sandwich just enough character to keep it from feeling too plain. A pinch of salt, maybe a touch of pepper, and that was all it needed. There was no presentation, no garnish, no second serving. Just a plate, often chipped at the edge, resting on a small table or even on a lap tray. These meals weren't about enjoyment in the usual sense. They were about keeping a routine, maintaining something steady in a day that might otherwise pass without much change. The act of eating was quiet. Each bite slow, deliberate, almost absent-minded. Sometimes paired with tea, sometimes not. But always in the same calm, undisturbed way. Over time, meals like this became more than just food. They marked the passing of hours, small anchors in a long afternoon. And even now, for those who remember, that gentle combination of egg and cress still carries a quiet echo of simpler, lonelier days. There were days when even the smallest effort felt like too much, and lunch became something that required almost no preparation at all. In many British homes, one such quiet staple was beans on toast. It was warm, filling, and ready in minutes, perfect for seniors living alone who needed something simple but steady. The routine rarely changed. A slice or two of bread placed into a toaster, the faint smell of it browning filling the kitchen. Meanwhile, a small saucepan sat on the stove, holding a tin of baked beans slowly heating. The gentle bubbling sound was often the only noise in the room, soft and repetitive, like a clock ticking away unnoticed. Once ready, the beans were poured over the toast without much thought. Sometimes they soaked straight through, making the bread soft and heavy. Other times, the toast held just enough firmness to carry each bite. There was no concern for appearance, only that it was warm and easy to eat. For many, this meal was more than convenience. It was something they had known for decades, stretching back to harder times when simple foods were all that was available. It carried a quiet reliability, something that didn't change even as life around them did. There were no extra dishes, no effort to make it special. Just a plate, a fork, and a moment of stillness. Perhaps eaten by a window, watching nothing in particular, or at a small table that had long stopped hosting others. And in that quiet, beans on toast became more than just a quick meal. It was a small comfort, something warm in a day that otherwise felt still, familiar in a life that had slowly grown quieter over time. Some lunches were made not from hunger, but from what happened to be left in the cupboard. In many British homes, especially among seniors living alone, sardines on toast became one of those quiet, dependable meals. It required almost no effort, yet it carried a distinct presence, something both simple and oddly comforting. The tin was small, often tucked away and forgotten until needed. Opening it released a familiar, slightly sharp scent that filled the kitchen for just a moment before settling. The sardines, preserved in oil or tomato sauce, were carefully placed onto slices of toast, sometimes mashed gently with a fork to spread them more evenly. The toast itself was basic, brown just enough to hold its shape. A thin layer of butter might melt beneath the fish, blending into the warmth. There was no attempt to dress it up, no extra ingredients added. It was eaten exactly as it was, plain, direct, and filling. For many, this meal traced back to years when nothing was wasted. Tinned fish lasted long, cost little, and provided enough nourishment to carry someone through the afternoon. Over time, it became more than just a practical choice. It became a familiar fallback, something to rely on when energy was low and the day felt particularly quiet. There was often no rush while eating. Each bite taken slowly, without distraction, sometimes accompanied by a cup of tea or simply the silence of the room. The simplicity of it all made the moment feel longer, stretching time in a way that only solitary routines can. And even now, that modest combination, sardines and toast, remains tied to a certain kind of afternoon. One where very little was said, very little was needed, and yet, somehow, it was enough. There were afternoons when the kitchen stayed almost untouched, when even turning on the stove felt unnecessary. On those days, many seniors in Britain relied on something as simple as a cold ham sandwich. It wasn't cooked, not really prepared, just quietly assembled from what was already there. The ham was usually kept wrapped in paper, stored carefully to make it last. A few thin slices would be taken out, never more than needed. The bread, often soft in the center and slightly firm at the edges, was laid out with the same familiar care. Butter might be spread lightly, though sometimes it was skipped altogether. There was no effort to build layers or add extras. No lettuce, no sauces, just ham and bread. It was a meal reduced to its most basic form, shaped by years of habit and the understanding that simple was enough. For many, this kind of lunch carried a quiet echo of earlier life. It might have once been packed for work, eaten quickly during a break, or shared in busier times. But now it existed in stillness. The same sandwich, but in a very different setting. The act of eating was unhurried. A bite taken while standing by the counter, or sitting alone at a small table that had long since lost its daily conversations. There was no need for plates sometimes, just a folded napkin and a moment of pause. Meals like this weren't meant to be remembered, yet they stayed with people. Not for their taste, but for the feeling they carried, quiet, steady, and unchanged. And in those silent kitchens, a simple ham sandwich became more than just food. It was a reminder that even the smallest routines could continue, even when everything else had slowly faded into the background. Some lunches were born out of sheer practicality, meals that required almost no preparation yet somehow felt satisfying. One of these was the humble shepherd's pie, or at least a miniature, simplified version suitable for one. For seniors living alone in mid-20th century Britain, this wasn't the kind of dish made for guests. It was made for comfort, warmth, and ease. The recipe was stripped down to essentials: leftover mashed potatoes, a small portion of minced meat, and perhaps a few frozen peas if they were on hand. Everything was layered carefully in a small oven-proof dish, then slid under the grill just long enough to heat through. There was no fuss with fancy seasonings or decorative toppings. The goal was a hot, filling meal that could be eaten with minimal effort. The smell of cooking mashed potatoes and meat often filled the small kitchen, creating a sense of homeliness in a quiet, otherwise empty flat. For many seniors, these aromas were deeply tied to memories of family dinners long past, echoing a time when kitchens were filled with chatter rather than silence. Once cooked, the portion was modest, just enough for one. A single spoonful offered warmth and nourishment, a little comfort in an afternoon that might otherwise have felt long and uneventful. Eating slowly, bite by bite, allowed the simple flavors to settle, each mouthful a small ritual that marked the passing of time. Over the years, these small shepherd's pies became more than just meals. They were reminders of routines, of days shaped around quiet but steady rhythms. And for those who remember, even a pared-down dish for one could bring the faintest echo of warmth, family, and the ordinary joys of a life once shared. Some lunches were nothing more than what could be grabbed and eaten without turning on a stove, and yet they carried a surprising sense of comfort. One such meal for seniors living alone was cold kippers with bread. Though unusual to modern tastes, this simple combination was once a reliable part of British cupboards and morning routines that stretched into quiet afternoons. Kippers came pre-smoked, kept in tins or vacuum-sealed packets, ready to be eaten without cooking. Opening one released a strong, salty aroma that filled the small kitchen immediately, sharp but oddly grounding. The fish, often split and laid flat, was paired with a slice of bread, sometimes buttered lightly, sometimes dry. Each bite was a balance of the smoky fish and soft bread, simple yet filling. There was no fancy plating or second helpings. Just a small plate on the table, perhaps beside a steaming cup of tea, and the muted ticking of a clock somewhere in the background. The meal was quiet, solitary, and without ceremony. But for those who ate it, it became a familiar, comforting ritual, a small moment of satisfaction in an otherwise still day. This was not just about sustenance. It was about maintaining a routine, preserving a sense of normalcy when life had slowed down and rooms felt emptier than before. Each bite connected them to a past when family breakfasts and lively kitchens were the norm, offering a whisper of those memories in an afternoon of solitude. Even now, thinking back on a simple plate of kippers and bread evokes the same mix of practicality and nostalgia. A meal for one, yet a quiet companion in a world that had gradually grown silent. Some meals were almost ritualistic in their simplicity, designed to be prepared in minutes yet still offer a sense of completeness. For many seniors living alone in mid-century Britain, tuna salad on bread was one such lunch. It required no cooking, just a few ingredients, and yet it carried a quiet satisfaction that made the solitary afternoon feel less empty. A small tin of tuna was opened, drained, and gently flaked into a bowl. Sometimes a spoonful of mayonnaise was added, a pinch of salt or pepper if remembered, and then it was lightly mixed. The bread, usually soft white or wholemeal, was laid out, occasionally buttered, and the tuna spread evenly across the slices. For those who liked a little texture, a few slices of cucumber or a leaf of lettuce might be tucked inside, though often it remained just tuna and bread, plain, functional, and steady. There was no thought of presentation or impressing anyone. The plate was set simply on a table or even a lap tray, often accompanied by a cup of tea or perhaps nothing at all. Eating became a quiet ritual, a measured pause in the day where each bite was taken slowly, almost meditatively, in the stillness of an empty room. Over time, this unremarkable combination became more than a meal. It marked routine, stability, and a small sense of control in lives that had grown quieter and more solitary. Even the simplest lunches carried a kind of comfort, a familiar taste that reminded them of habits built over decades. And so, a modest tuna salad on bread, unassuming as it seemed, became part of the rhythm of the day, filling not just the stomach, but the quiet spaces left by time, loneliness, and memory. Some lunches required almost no effort, yet somehow left a lasting impression on those who ate them quietly, alone. One such meal for seniors in Britain was simply buttered toast with marmalade. It might seem trivial, even mundane, but in small kitchens and silent afternoons, it became a tiny ritual of comfort and familiarity. The bread was sliced thick, often white and slightly soft in the middle. Butter was spread carefully, melting slowly into the warm surface, while the marmalade, sometimes a deep, bitter Seville orange variety, was spooned across with just enough to add sweetness and tang. Each bite combined textures and flavors that were simple, yet strangely satisfying. There was no rush, no concern for company or presentation. Just a plate, often chipped at the edges, sitting on a small table or tray, and the muted sounds of the room. A clock ticking, distant traffic, or the occasional creak of floorboards. Eating became a quiet act of reflection, a way to mark the passing of the day without fanfare. This unassuming meal carried more than flavor. For many seniors, it echoed memories of mornings when kitchens were filled with family chatter, of days when marmalade was a luxury, and of routines that provided structure to an otherwise quiet life. Even as time passed and tables grew emptier, buttered toast with marmalade remained a small, comforting anchor. A predictable pleasure in a world that had grown slower and quieter. And so, the simplicity of this lunch belied its significance. It was more than bread and marmalade, it was a quiet companion, a familiar taste that bridged past and present, filling empty afternoons with the soft, enduring comfort of routine. These 10 lunches may seem simple, even ordinary, but for seniors living alone in mid-century Britain, they were small acts of care. Quiet routines that filled empty afternoons and offered a sense of comfort. Each meal tells a story of practicality, habit, and the subtle ways food connected people to their past. From beans on toast to marmalade-topped bread, these forgotten recipes remind us that even the humblest dishes can carry meaning, warmth, and nostalgia. If you enjoyed stepping back into these quiet kitchens, make sure to subscribe to America's Lost Recipes and keep discovering the meals and memories we've nearly forgotten.